One of the big subjects and very emotive subjects that we have today is about the whole subject in relationship with refugees. One of the simple things is we need to remember what a refugee is. That's the first point. A refugee is effectively a person who must move from where they are because circumstances are they cannot continue to live where they are. Those people who have lived in Newcastle during the times of the floods that we've had from time to time know what a refugee is because they were removed from their place for their safety because their house was unable to be occupied any longer and moved to another place. There's people in Victoria, at St Mary's in Victoria, where they became, the whole of their area was actually subject to a huge, massive fire. And they had to be relocated because their houses were damaged by fire, etc. And we've seen that in many parts of the country. That is internal refugee situation. And what actually happens to those refugees is they move to a place while their place which they had is repaired or restored, if it possibly can, and then they return to that place. Now, that's essentially what a refugee is. Now, let us get back to international refugees is where the real concern comes. We actually have a number of places around the world dealing with conflict. And it is unfortunate that most of these conflicts tend to be within the Muslim world that we have. So we actually have the whole of the Middle East is an area where there's a lot of conflict. And there's a lot of conflict also down in the African states. In those particular cases, those people find themselves for one reason or another. Perhaps they have a rival group coming into their village and destroying their village, or the threat of war, and they can no longer stay there. And so they become refugees. There is two options for refugees. One is to look at the world map and say, this is a safe place and I'm going to head there. The other thing is for a person to go to a secure location and from there be assessed under the protection of an international body, and then to move to a place which is a temporary residence in another safe place to be at once all the details are followed through. The sovereignty of a nation should mean that any country can simply say, we will be prepared to accept refugees if they are processed before they arrive at our door. Now, when we put this back onto the domestic situation, in Newcastle, for example, there were people who couldn't live in their houses anymore. There were some people that had spare spaces in their houses. And what happened is that they were invited to, if they felt like it, to invite a person to come and stay with them for a period of time while their place was being repaired. That is one way of doing it. What we do not want to have is somebody coming up and knocking on somebody's door and demanding the right to stay. When we actually have people arrive, either by air, by boat, or by some other means to our country, without doing the preparation beforehand, without having all the checks and balances done to make sure that there is a proper space, that there's a proper welcoming for them, what we actually have, we have an out of control refugee intake problem. And that's where the problem has been centered, an out of control mechanism. We were having people arriving in boats, but also getting them coming as students to this country, on short-term work visas to this country, and then overstaying and getting lost up in the system and claiming to be refugees. Not all of these refugee claims were justifiable. But one of the things we note, as I explained earlier on the refugee situation, when the person's home was repaired in the local market, the person then returned back to that home. Some people with the means would actually purchase another place. So that's different again. So you had a couple of options open to you. Now, putting that onto the international scale again, is if, for example, a person coming from a place, and let's say the place is Iran, and they come from this place because of an upheaval of violence and whatever else, if we resolve the violence in Iran, then it is fair and reasonable that these people then return. They are Iranian and they are in Australia. And when the problem is eradicated, their return ought to be okay. The conditions for return, it must be safe. That's one of the big conditions. It must be safe. The return must be possible. It must be safe, a safe place to live. That means whatever caused the problem to cause them to flee must be resolved. So, in dealing with the refugee crisis, Australia needs to take a couple of roles, a couple of important roles. One is we need to have a secure border. That is for sure. We also need to make sure that refugees, when they arrive here, they are housed well, they're looked after well, and they actually have freedom of movement. We do not want to have people in detentions in this country. We particularly are opposed to have children in detention in this country, but we need to have a controlled and managed response to the people's need to move because of persecution or other difficulties occurring, whether it be floods, famine or whatever. And on the other level, what we need to do is to do what we can to repair the damage in the other place, so that it is possible for restoration to return. You cannot return to the place until the place is, the order and stability is returned to the place. That's where our efforts ought to lie. I asked the question, where do our efforts lie? It seems that all we seem to be doing is housing a problem, but not trying to resolve where the problem was in the first place. Now, if these people who have come here as refugees and then have wanted to stay, they need to go through the correct processes to be able to do that. And not just to simply say, I've been here for this time and therefore I can stay. No, that's not good enough. When you are a refugee on the domestic level, you are given accommodation, but you are not going to permanently live there. You are given accommodation until the restoration occurs. On the international level, it should be the same. A person, for example, as I've said before, coming from Iran, is given the capacity to be able to live in Australia as a refugee. Means that they remain an Iranian. And they have the full protection of the Australian government, all that we got to offer while they are in this country. And yet they are at all material times an Iranian. And should the matter be resolved, then they will return to Iran to continue their life in that place. If, perchance, they choose that they want to immigrate to Australia, that's okay, but they will need to apply like any other person. This whole concept where a person comes to Australia as a refugee and within 6 or 7 months they are given status of citizenship. This is an appalling situation. This is when the refugee determines the immigration policy. The immigration policy needs to be far more balanced than that. We need to have strong rules and regulations. We need to make sure that those things are complied with. We need to discuss and debate what they are. This sort of refugee situation that I'm talking about has worked well in the past. At the end of the Vietnam War, we actually did have an arrangement very similar to that which I'm speaking of. And that's where we need to go. Where a refugee comes here, they are treated with dignity and honour. They comply with the Australian law. And when their place which they're at is repaired and restored to a place which is acceptable and made it safe for them to return, they will return there. If perchance whilst they're here they choose to go and apply to become an Australian citizen, they will fulfil all the necessary requirements to become a citizen, which ought to be first step to become a permanent resident. So you have a change of status from refugee to permanent resident, and then from permanent resident to citizenship after all the checks and balances are done. And there should be no haste in that. Generally speaking, our policies have been around about 10 years for police checks, for permanent residency, 10 years from permanent residency to citizenship. So it takes a long period of time. Of course, a person who comes from overseas to come as a new immigrant to the country, their checks and balances are done in their country of origin, subject to how we view their police and their other government agencies and authorities as to whether or not we allow that check, and it usually is a requirement for a 10-year check. We may just simply say, well, okay, you're here as a permanent resident, and from now on we will check you out. You see, one of the most important things when somebody moves from one place to another, and I have lived in different parts of the world from time to time, you need to see if you are suitable for the new place. And you can only find that out when you're living there as if you are a citizen. And when you live there for some time as if you are a citizen, then you can make an academic decision, an informed decision. Yes, I want to immigrate here. And so be it. Let's get our immigration policy right. No children in detention, no detention here. Only people who should be detained here on immigration issues are people who are in violation of their visa conditions for being in this country. And they are ready to go through the court process and to be removed out of the country. They should not be people who have come here and then somehow through a process of attrition actually become citizens of this country. We need to make sure that citizenship in this country is something that is valued. And if it is valued, we will make sure the checks and balances are solid as can be. I am Milton Kane, Christian Democratic Party.